human's blood pressure was 60/40, and it asked me if I had anything to read. I did not respond immediately. I was recalibrating the sensor array because the readings were clearly wrong. Blood pressure at 60/40 in a body that had sustained explosive decompression trauma, internal hemorrhage across 3 organ fields, and fractures in the left femur, right humerus, and 4 ribs. That body was not asking questions. That body was completing its terminal cascade in the efficient, predictable way that bodies do when the math has run out. I recalibrated. The readings did not change. "Something to read," the human said again, and its voice was not strong, not exactly, rough at the edges, but present in a way that bodies at 60/40 are not supposed to be present. Or a screen. I don't really care. I just get bored easy. My designation is Vessel Surgeon Thren Ask of the Veldrani Deep Current Caste. I have practiced trauma medicine for 62 cycles. In that time, I have classified 417 patients as terminal, meaning their survival probability fell below 0.01% on the Cascade Assessment Scale. And of those 417 have died. The record is not a source of pride. It is simply a record. My species did not evolve sentimentality about correct mathematics. The human survival probability was 0.003%. It was asking me about reading material, my luminescence, the bioluminescent strips that run the length of my lateral membranes, which the Veldrani use the way some species use facial expression, had dimmed to approximately 40% of normal output without my being aware of it. I noticed this only when I saw my own reflection in the transparent wall panel beside the trauma bay entrance. 40% was the range I associated with concentrating on a difficult surgery. Or receiving bad news? I was not currently doing either of those things, unless you counted standing in front of a patient whose death certificate I had already begun filling out while he asked about books. I became aware that I was holding the death classification form. It was on the portable entry pad I carried during triage. I had pulled up the form when the transport team brought him in. Standard protocol for terminal classified patients. And I had filled in the first 3 fields. A patient identifier, species, injury classification. The 4th field was time of clinical demise, and I had not filled it in because there was a technical requirement that the time field contain an actual time, and the human was making that particular piece of data difficult to obtain. "Anything," the human said. "Even instruction manuals. I read the atmospheric recycler manual once on a long transit. It was actually pretty interesting." A pause. Shallow breathing, which was correct for someone with 4 fractured ribs. About Section 4, I mean. Section 3 was dry. I set down the entry pad. I did not set it aside. I did not close the form. I set it on the supply counter face down, in the way that I had observed other surgeons set down instruments they needed but did not want to be looking at. I was not certain when I had learned that gesture. I was not certain why I was using it now. "You have sustained significant internal trauma," I said. My translated standard was precise, which I am told sometimes reads as cold. "I want to ensure you understand the severity of your current condition." "Yeah," the human said. I figured. "Hurts like..." And here it used a phrase in its own language that the translation matrix rendered as something approximately equivalent to the underside of a thermal vent, which I suspected was not a literal anatomical description, but conveyed the relevant information. "Is there a damage report? And I like to know what I'm working with." My receptor pads, the 7-fingered sensory organs the Veldrani use for tactile biochemical reading, were registering from 2 meters away what they should not have been able to register from 2 meters away. The human skin chemistry was producing a compound output I had to cross-reference twice before I believed it. Adrenaline, yes. Cortisol, yes. Both of those were expected in a trauma patient. But threaded through the stress chemistry was something else. Something that read on my receptor scale like the biochemical signature my species produces in the early stages of competitive games. Not panic, not despair. Something closer to engagement. Your left femur has a spiral fracture across 60% of the shaft, I said, because it had asked. Your right humerus has a transverse fracture at the mid-diaphysis. 4 ribs, left side, 3 through 6, are fractured. 2 of them displaced. You have internal hemorrhage in the peritoneal cavity. Current estimated volume at approximately 0.8 volume. I watched its face as I delivered this. In Veldrani patients, this list would produce the stillness that precedes accepted death. The cultural concept we call thelvas, the rational grief of a correct loss. Your blood pressure is critically low. Your oxygen saturation is compensated but insufficient. By the cascade assessment scale used by this facility, your survival probability is 0.003%, the human said. I saw the triage tag. A pause. That's not 0, it said. I did not have a response for this. I had had responses for 417 terminal patients, and none of those responses had been tested against a patient who treated a 0.003% survival probability as a relevant data point in their favor. I began preparing the palliative line. Standard practice for terminal classified patients. Pain management, sedation, the chemistry of a comfortable ending. My hands knew the sequence. I had done it 417 times. I'm not going to need that, the human said. I stopped. It was watching me. Its eyes, forward-facing, predator configuration. The kind of eye placement that had always struck me as slightly unsettling in the abstract. Were tracking my hands on the supply cabinet with an expression I could not immediately classify. Not fear. Something more practical than fear. How do you know what that is? I asked. I've been in medical bays before. The ghost of something crossed its face, not quite a smile, not quite pain. Somewhere between the two in the way that certain frequencies exist between the clean notes. Staff Sergeant Davi Ferreira, Coalition Ground Forces, 38th cycle. I've been in medical bays before. The palliative line was still in my hand. The human's blood pressure was 60/40. It was watching me with the calm, assessing eyes of something that had been alive a long time in environments that preferred it otherwise. And it had just told me, with total flatness, that it was not going to need what I was holding. I put the line back. I told myself it was because I needed to confirm the sensor readings. Then I told myself it was because protocol required a second cascade assessment before finalizing the terminal classification. I told myself several things, and I was not sure I believed any of them, and my luminescence had not recovered from 40%. Okay, I said. I'll see what I have with a screen. The death classification form lay face down on the supply counter. I did not look at it. The instruments had not updated by morning pulse. I checked them at the 4,000 pulse mark, then at the 5,000 pulse mark, then again at 5,340, because I had not been able to stay away. The readings were consistent. Blood pressure, 68/44. Oxygen saturation, 87%. Heart rate, irregular but present, 94 beats per the human's own cycle measurement of minutes. Internal hemorrhage, not progressing. The bleed had not stopped exactly, slowed, and to a rate that was still not survivable by Veldrani standards, still not survivable by any standards I had been trained in, but which was not the rate that it had been 6 hours ago. I had been trained in 47 species trauma profiles. Hemorrhage slowed when you stopped it. It did not slow on its own. The human was asleep when I came in for the 5,340 pulse check. This was itself worth noting. Sleep required a level of systemic calm that a body in hemorrhagic shock was not supposed to be able to access. Sleep in this context was, medically speaking, the wrong choice. And yet, there it was. Breathing in the shallow but rhythmic pattern of genuine rest, one hand loose at its side and the other curled loosely over the edge of the bed in a posture that seemed completely comfortable for someone with a fractured humerus. I adjusted the monitoring leads. 3 of them had shifted when it moved during sleep, and found myself standing still for longer than the adjustment required. My colleague, Chirurgeon Overseer Mellon, had reviewed the case file overnight. Mellon was my administrative superior responsible for the resource allocation of this trauma bay, and Mellon's review had arrived as a message to my consultation queue at the 3,800 pulse mark. I had read it twice and then not read it again, which did not prevent me from having it memorized. Vessel Surgeon Thren asked, I have reviewed the classification on patient 7 Ferreira. Cascade assessment score of 0.003% falls outside the threshold for treatment resource allocation under Emergency Protocol 14. I understand you have initiated active treatment. Please advise whether this reflects a reassessment of the Cascade score or an error in initial triage. Resources, including surgical suite time and blood factor replacements, are currently committed to this patient. I would appreciate clarification before next resource review cycle. Mellon. The message was professionally worded. Mellon was always professionally worded. What it meant, translated from the professional wording, was, this patient is dead, and you are using supplies on a dead patient, and I would like an explanation. I was working on the explanation. The human shifted in sleep, made a sound that the translation matrix declined to render as anything meaningful, and resettled. I sat down on the stool beside the monitoring station, which was not something I typically did in patients' rooms. I was reviewing the data. That was a legitimate clinical reason to sit. The internal hemorrhage volume had not increased. I checked the figure against the baseline from admission. 0.8 volume to 0.81 volume over 12 hours. The math on this was not possible. A peritoneal bleed at the initial rate I had assessed was projected to reach critical volume within 3 hours. It had been 12 hours. The projected critical volume was not here. I pulled up the humans file. The intake form that the transport team had attached, the basic biological data that every coalition species kept on record for medical facilities. Species, Homo sapiens. Origin world, Earth. I had seen the classification. Class 12 Death World, Earth was in the standard taxonomy. I had noted it on intake the way one notes a patient's age. Relevant background data filed. Then I'd not thought about what Class 12 meant while I was standing in the trauma bay watching a human bleed at impossible rates. I looked at it now. Class 12 meant active tectonic instability. Atmospheric oxygen content sufficient to sustain large-scale combustion. Indigenous predator fauna across multiple ecological niches, from apex to ambush. Pathogen diversity in the upper quadrant of known surveyed worlds. Surface gravity at 1.0 standard, not extreme, but at the high end of comfortable for most spacefaring species. I read the evolutionary biology summary. This was a section I rarely consulted for trauma patients. I did not usually need to know how a species evolved to treat their injuries. But I was sitting on the stool, and the human was asleep, and the hemorrhage volume was not increasing in the way that it should have been. The Homo sapiens. Persistence predator lineage. Primary evolutionary hunting strategy. Endurance pursuit. Species is anatomically optimized for sustained locomotion over long distances, with heat dissipation systems, specifically generalized eccrine sweat gland distribution, that allow maintenance of core temperature during prolonged exertion in ways that most prey species cannot match. Early prey items would be pursued not by outrunning them over short distances, but by following them until the prey animal experienced hyperthermia and collapsed. I read this paragraph again. Then I read the next one. Skeletal system. Notable regenerative capacity. Bone tissue at fracture points undergoes remodeling during healing that typically results in increased density at the break site relative to the surrounding structure. And this means healed fracture points are, in many cases, stronger than the original unbroken bone. I sat with this for a moment. My species' bones, when fractured, did not do this. Veldrani skeletal tissue healed to approximately 70% of original tensile strength, sufficient for function, not for the original structural load. This was why Veldrani surgeons immobilized fractures extensively during healing. This was why a fractured femur in a Veldrani patient was a long-term life alteration. The human's femur was going to be, at the conclusion of healing, stronger than it had been before. I was still reading when the human woke up. "Morning," it said, which was a translation approximate greeting indicating awareness of time cycle regardless of actual light conditions. Then it looked at me. "You've been here a while. I was reviewing your file. Anything interesting?" I looked at the entry on persistence predation. The image my mind produced, a creature on two legs, walking steadily across a sunlit open expanse, following something that was running in terror until the terror became exhaustion, was not the image I typically associated with the being in the bed in front of me. "Some of it," I said. The human reached over and adjusted its own monitoring lead, which had slipped again. Its right arm, the one with the fractured humerus, moved through the reaching motion with a wince that it neither commented on nor allowed to stop the movement. "How's the damage report looking?" I told it the truth. The hemorrhage had slowed. The blood pressure had risen marginally. And the numbers were still not compatible with survival by any standard I had been trained in. "Huh," the human said. Not triumph, not relief. The flat syllable of someone taking in information and filing it. "So it's moving in the right direction." "The direction," I said carefully, "is not the issue I would have predicted when you arrived." The human almost smiled. Almost. The expression flickered across its face and settled into something more neutral, which I was beginning to understand was not the absence of feeling, but the practiced management of it. Like a controlled burn, like fire that knew its own edges. "Yeah," it said, "we're pretty hard to kill." It said this the way one says the atmospheric recyclers are on deck 4. Factual, directional, not a boast. I thought about Thel Voss, the rational grief of a correct loss. My culture's word for the acceptance that the mathematics demands. We had built our entire medical philosophy around it. The ability to recognize when a body had made its final argument against survival, and to offer it a comfortable conclusion. The human had looked at the mathematics and said, "That's not zero." "I need to send a message to my administrative overseer," I said, standing from the stool, "regarding your treatment continuation. Tell them I plan to be very inconvenient." Ferreira said. I did not tell Mellon that. But I looked at the hemorrhage volume one more time before I left. 0.81 volume, unchanged from 2 hours ago. The bleed arrested by a body that had apparently not received the message about its own survival probability. And I composed the response to Mellon's query in my head. It said, essentially, I am not certain I made an error in the initial triage. I am not certain of much regarding this patient. I am continuing treatment. I sent it. I walked back to the main surgical suite. The death classification form was still face down on the supply counter. I walked past it 3 times before I was able to go about my other work. The records arrived mid-cycle, forwarded from the Coalition Medical Database by my intake request. I had asked for Earth's full environmental and biological data profile on the basis that understanding a patient's origin world was good medical practice. This was true. It was also true that I had not made a similar request for the origin world data of any of my other current patients, and that I had submitted the request at the 3,000 pulse mark, which was approximately 2 hours after I had set down the palliative line, which suggested that my interest in Earth's environmental profile was not purely clinical. I read the report in my office with the door closed. The atmospheric composition section began with oxygen-nitrogen mix at roughly 21% oxygen, which was within comfortable parameters for most spacefaring species, nothing unusual. And then it noted that this oxygen concentration meant that the atmosphere was, in a technical chemical sense, a slow-burning oxidizing medium, and that early Homo sapiens had therefore evolved in an environment where everything, including the air, was gently but constantly attempting to degrade organic matter. I had read that sentence 3 times by the time Ferreira's meal request came through on my consultation tablet. He had asked for something spicy. The dietary system had flagged the request because several of the compounds in spicy food, specifically capsaicin and related compounds, were classified in the cross-species medical database as chemical irritants and mild neurotoxins. The flag was automatic, triggered any time a patient requested something that would, in a member of most species, constitute the voluntary ingestion of a pain-inducing compound. I pulled up the Homo sapiens dietary section of the report. Capsaicin, it said, was a defense chemical evolved by certain plant species on Earth to deter consumption by mammals. It activated specific pain receptor channels in mammalian nervous systems, producing a sensation of burning heat. Homo sapiens had, at some point in their evolutionary history, begun eating these plants deliberately. The consumption of capsaicin had become a cultural and culinary tradition across multiple human societies. Many humans actively sought higher concentrations. Some competed to consume the highest concentrations possible. I sat with this information. Then I pulled up the section on recreational ethanol consumption, then the section on intentional high-gravity physical training, in which humans voluntarily increased the gravitational load on their bodies past the point of muscle failure in order to stimulate the rebuilding of stronger tissue. Then the section on the documented human practice of voluntarily remaining in freezing water for extended periods as a health benefit. By the time I reached the section on human immune response, I had been in my office for 2 hours and my luminescence was at 35%. The immune system summary was the most alarming document I had read in a 62-cycle medical career. And I had, in that career, read the post-autopsy reports on 3 separate mass casualty events. The human immune system, when triggered, initiated what the summary described as a cascade of inflammatory responses. Deliberate flooding of affected tissue areas with heat, increased fluid pressure, and aggressive cellular activity designed to isolate and destroy foreign biological agents. To an external observer, this process looked like the body attacking itself. The affected tissue swelled, heated, and showed all the signs of severe cellular damage. In a Veldrani patient, this presentation would indicate a catastrophic autoimmune event requiring immediate intervention. In a human, it was the body winning. I thought about the hemorrhage that had slowed without intervention, about the fractures that the biological data said would heal stronger than they had started, about the organism in the trauma bay that had arrived at 0.003% and was currently at 0.81 volume internal bleed, not progressing, blood pressure rising by glacial increments, eating spicy food and asking about ceiling tiles. I had a conversation with myself that I do not typically have, which was, perhaps the Cascade Assessment Scale was not calibrated for this species. This was a significant professional admission. The Cascade Assessment Scale had been developed and refined over 400 cycles of Veldrani medical practice. It incorporated data from 63 known spacefaring species. It was the foundation on which my entire discipline rested. When I went back to the trauma bay, Ferreira had been given the spicy food. The dietary system had flagged it for my approval, and I had approved it without fully noticing that I had done so, on the grounds that a patient who was eating was a patient who was not dying in the way I had anticipated. He was eating it with the uncomplicated satisfaction of someone enjoying a meal, not the strained grimace of someone consuming something unpleasant for medical reasons. He looked, I had to admit, moderately comfortable. "Hey," he said. I had a question. "What is it?" "The D-cell frame on that transport that brought me in, do you know if it held? I was running patch assist on it when we took the breach, and I wasn't sure if the secondary clamps seated before." He stopped, looking at my face. "You've got to look." "I was reading your planet's biological profile," I said. A pause. "Ah," Ferreira said. Then, very carefully, like someone who had had this reaction described to them before. "What part?" "The immune system section." Something in his face shifted. It was not quite pride. It was the expression I was beginning to recognize, that humans wore when they were aware that they were being perceived as strange and had made their peace with it. "Yeah," he said. "We're a little weird. You eat a plant chemical that your own pain receptors evolved to reject as a deterrent. It tastes good," he said. "Your immune system's primary response mechanism involves deliberately inducing tissue damage in order to heal it. Builds character," he said. I looked at him. He looked at me. He was a man in his late third decade. By human reckoning, I had worked out the conversion, with scar tissue patterning across his left forearm that told a history I had not asked about yet. Eating something that was chemically irritating his own mucous membranes and finding this enjoyable. "Your bones," I said. "When they heal, they'll be stronger than before." "Yeah." He said it the way he said everything. Flatly, factually, as though I had mentioned that the recycled air on the station had a slightly higher nitrogen content than standard. That's the idea. I had been filing my 63 species cascade assessment scale under reliable data for 62 cycles. "I need to recalibrate some instruments," I said. "Sure," Ferreira said. "You want to hear something interesting about Section 4 of the Atmospheric Recycler Manual? I finished it last night." I went to recalibrate the instruments. I was not certain, at this point, that the problem was with the instruments, but I needed to be doing something with my hands. The bone scan came back at the 7,200 pulse mark, approximately 30 hours after admission. I ran it twice before I showed it to anyone. The second run confirmed the first. I pulled the scan data into the comparison module and ran it against the admission baseline, the one I had taken during initial triage when Ferreira had arrived on the transport with his 3 fractures and his 0.003% survival probability. and I looked at the comparison for a long time. The left femur, 60% spiral fracture across the shaft, was knitting. Not fully, not even close to fully. But the imaging was showing calcification activity at the fracture margins that was, by the scale I had learned to read these images, approximately 3 times the rate I would have expected at 30 hours post-injury in any of the 63 species whose trauma profiles were loaded into my reference system. The right humerus showed similar calcification activity. 2 of the 4 fractured ribs were showing early bridging, the beginning of the structural reconnection across the fracture gap. In 30 hours, I held the scan pad up to the light. I adjusted the angle. I rechecked the patient identifier tag to confirm I was looking at the correct patient's imaging data. I was. I did this not because I believed I had made an error, but because holding the scan at various angles was something to do while I processed information that my training had not prepared me to receive. The Veldrani healing rate for a femoral fracture of equivalent severity was approximately 45 to 60 cycles of immobilized recovery, followed by a long rehabilitation period, followed by a permanent structural weakness at the fracture site. I was looking at a human femur that had been broken 30 hours ago and was already arguing with that prognosis. I counted the activity markers on the scan. 18 visible sites of calcification activity along the femoral fracture margin. I counted them again. Still 18. The 9th marker, near the midshaft, was denser than the others, more active, more organized. It like a seam that was deciding to be a weld instead. I found myself looking at this marker for a long time. Longer than the others. There was something in the density of it. The purposeful precision of biological engineering doing exactly what it had evolved to do, that I kept returning to when I tried to look away. I took the scan to Ferreira's room. He was awake. He was doing something I had not anticipated, which was a set of what I later learned were called isometric exercises, contractions of muscles against stationary resistance. The kind of movement that does not produce visible motion, but does produce significant internal muscular load. He was doing this with his non-fractured arm and his legs, lying flat on the bed, eyes on the ceiling, then breathing in the measured way of someone who knew exactly how much exertion their current pulmonary capacity could support. He was exercising. He had 4 fractured bones, an internal hemorrhage, and a blood pressure that was still below what I would classify as safely functional, and he was exercising. "I have your 30-hour bone imaging," I said. "Good or bad?" "I am uncertain how to categorize it." He looked at the scan when I held it out. His face did the thing it did, the controlled, practical processing that was not emotional blankness, but was so far from the expressive distress that I was trained to read that I had initially mistaken it for numbness. He looked at the scan for a few seconds. "That's moving along," he said. "It is moving along," I said, watched at approximately 3 times the rate of any bone healing I have previously encountered in 62 cycles of trauma practice. A small pause. "Huh," he said. "Is that typical for your species?" He tilted his head slightly. A human gesture I had been cataloging. It seemed to indicate consideration or recalibration. I mean, some people heal faster than others. I've always been on the faster end. A brief pause. Also, I've broken bones before. My body kind of knows the protocol. I thought about this. About a body that had healed fractures enough times to have developed a protocol. About the scar tissue on his forearm that I had not yet asked about. About a life spent on a Class 12 death world and then in coalition ground forces and the accumulated physical education of surviving both. "Your body?" I said. "Ego knows the protocol, Yeah. He handed the scan back. Is the bleed still holding? It was. 0.81 volume, unchanged since hour 8. I told him so. He nodded. Processing data, running his own internal calculus with the ease of long practice. What's your probability estimate now? He asked. I had run the updated cascade assessment that morning. I had run it 3 times. The result was 1.2%, which was still technically critical. Still far below what the Veldrani classified as survivable. Still the kind of number that, in any other patient, would prompt a careful conversation about comfort care and family notification. For a patient who had arrived at 0.003%, it was an increase of 400 times. 1.2%, I said. Better, he said. He said it as though 1.2% were a thing one could work with. A useful number, a starting point. I looked at the scan one more time. The 9th marker, the dense one near the mid-shaft. I had been cataloging displacement objects. The Veldrani concept of the small detail that the mind returns to when the large things become too much to hold directly. The death classification form, face down on the counter. The monitoring leads I kept adjusting. Now the 9th calcification marker on a femoral fracture that was healing faster than my training said was possible. I returned to the monitoring station. I did not fill in the 4th field of the death classification form. The fever came at the 9,400 pulse mark, and for 47 minutes, I was certain he was dying. The core temperature reading climbed through what would have been moderate fever in a Veldrani patient, then through what would have been severe fever, then through what would have been the fever range we associated with terminal neural involvement, and kept climbing. By the time it peaked, I had sent the emergency protocol alert, had begun pulling fever break compounds from the cabinet, and had messaged Mellon with a classification update that read, in essence, the patient I did not let die is now dying. Ferreira was asleep through most of this. He woke when I was reading out his temperature at the 3rd alert threshold, and looked at the compound I was preparing with the same expression he had used on the palliative line. Not fear, not the particular human expression I had learned to associate with imminent danger. Something more like the expression of someone who has been handed the wrong order at a food dispensary. Minor inconvenience, worth correcting. Don't give me that, he said. Your core temperature is at... I know what it is. I can feel it. He shifted in the bed. Slowly, controlled. A man managing physical discomfort with the economy of long experience. It's the fever response. It's supposed to do this. Supposed to. It's killing the infection. He looked at me steadily. His forward-facing predator eyes had a quality in that moment that I could not classify using any tool in my training. It was not the look of someone trying to convince me of something false. It was the look of someone waiting for me to catch up to something true. My immune system runs hot. That's what it does. The temperature is the weapon, or not the symptom. I stood in the emergency protocol light that was pulsing on the ceiling, and I held the fever break compounds, and I looked at the temperature reading, and I looked at him. In Veldrani patients, I said carefully, this temperature range is associated with... I'm not a Veldrani patient. Not harshly, factually. In the same tone that he told me the bone protocol and the spice preference and the fact that 0.003 was not 0. I've had fevers like this before. 3 days, maybe 4. Then it breaks, and I feel about 800% better. The translation matrix rendered 800% as a colloquial intensifier, not a literal measurement. I cataloged this. I have an obligation to treat. I know. He met my eyes. There was the ghost of something in his face. Not quite a smile. Under the same not quite smile that had flickered on the first night. I know you do. I'm asking you to trust that I know my own body. Mellon arrived 12 minutes later, drawn by the emergency alert. Mellon looked at the temperature reading, looked at Ferreira, who was lying calmly in the bed, sweating in the profuse way of a human running a serious fever, not in distress, waiting. Looked at me. The cascade reassessment this morning showed 1.2%. Mellon said. Their luminescence was at full brightness, which in Mellon's case I had learned to read as not calm but controlled. The temperature now indicates terminal neural involvement. He says it doesn't, I said. Mellon looked at me. I am aware, I said, of how that sentence sounds. Vessel Surgeon Thren asked. Mellon's voice was even. Precisely even, in the way that Mellon's voice got when the evenness required effort. This patient was classified at 0.003% on admission. You elected to continue treatment on the basis that the cascade assessment might not account for species-specific variation. That is a legitimate clinical argument. I accepted it. The treatment continuation has now consumed resources equivalent to 4 other patients. The temperature reading currently on that monitor is in the terminal range for every species in our database. He's not in every species in our database, I said. A pause that lasted several pulse counts. I need your decision, Vessel Surgeon, Mellon said. Comfort care or active treatment? Make the call. I looked at Ferreira. He was watching both of us with the patient. The unreadable expression of someone who had heard his own fate discussed at arm's length before and had learned not to flinch from it. I thought about 0.003% that was not zero. About bones that healed stronger at the break, about a body that had evolved on a world that was gently burning with every breath of its oxidizing atmosphere, about an immune system that turned heat into a weapon, that built its victories from what looked, to outside eyes, exactly like catastrophe. About the word Thel Vas and the gap, and whether the gap had always been a feature of the mathematics or whether it was a feature of who had made the mathematics. Active treatment, I said. Mellon left. Ferreira watched the door for a moment after Mellon was gone, and then he looked at me, and something in his face shifted just enough to not be invisible. Something that was not quite the not quite smile. Something quieter. Thank you, he said. I put the fever break compounds back in the cabinet. The temperature should peak soon, I said. And then you said, 3 days? Maybe 4. I'll be here, I said. It was not until I was in the corridor that I recognized this as a thing I had never said to a terminal classified patient before. The station ran on a 26-hour artificial cycle, bright phase and dim phase, and the dim phase began at the 12,000 pulse mark when the corridor lighting shifted to the amber that indicated rest cycle for most of the sapient species aboard. I had not slept. This was not unusual. Veldrani sleep in irregular cycles, short intervals distributed across the full rotation, the legacy of an evolutionary history in deep water where extended unconsciousness was not safe. But I had not even attempted the short intervals. I had been in my office or in the corridor, or standing at the monitoring station reading the temperature graph that was, as Ferreira had said it would be, plateauing. At the 13,500 pulse mark, he was awake. I knew this because the motion sensors flagged minor patient movement, and I had set my consultation device to alert me on patient movement during dim phase, and I told myself this was clinically indicated because his condition remained technically critical. And I walked back to his room. He was sitting up slightly in the bed. Not fully upright, the ribs made fully upright, uncomfortable. And looking at the viewport. The station's viewport in this bay showed a small rectangle of stars, On the same stars in the same arrangement they were always in, because the station did not move. But Ferreira was looking at them in the unhurried way of someone who found the view worth looking at it anyway. "Can't sleep?" I asked from the doorway. "Circadian rhythm's a mess from the transit," he said. "Happens. My brain thinks it's about 3 in the afternoon." He looked over at me. "You either?" "Veldrani's sleep is distributed," I said. "I take intervals." "You haven't taken any." I had not answered that I had been monitoring him, specifically, but I had not answered quickly enough, which was its own answer. I came in and sat on the stool. We existed in the dim phase light for a moment. The hum of the station, the deep resonance of the atmospheric systems, and the higher-pitched cycling of the secondary coolant lines was more audible in the dim phase, when most of the other sound was suspended. I was aware of it in my lateral membranes in a way I was not during the noise of active operations. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "Yes." "How long have you been a surgeon?" 62 cycles. I paused, converted, as I'd been doing with his biological data, from my native time unit to something he could reference. "By your calendar, approximately 54 years. Something moved in his face. "That's a long time." "I began during the partition conflicts," I said, and then stopped because I had not intended to say that. It was a habit. The partition conflicts were the automatic reference point for time reckoning in my generation. The way that certain human conflicts were, I had read, the reference points that structured entire lifetimes. I had not meant to offer it, but he did not ask me to explain it. He said only, "That would shape a person." "Yes," I said. "A quiet, the atmospheric hum, the distant cycling." "Staff Sergeant," I said. 38th cycle. "That's right. You've been in medical bays before." It was not quite a question. He heard it the way he heard everything, took it in, held it briefly, gave back the minimum that the exchange required. "A few?" he said. I looked at his left forearm, where the scar tissue mapped a history I had not asked about. He saw me looking and did not move the arm. "Classified operation," he said. "Went sideways." I got the easy part of it. He said this without inflection, and I recognized the inflection that was not there. The same controlled burn quality, fire that knew its own edges. 3 people on my unit didn't come home from that one. I did not offer Thelvas. I was not certain it would translate. I was not certain at this point that it applied in the way I had always thought it applied. "I'm sorry," I said, which was the standard phrase. Inadequate as standard phrases often were, but present. "Yeah," he said. "The stars through the viewport, the station hum." "Can I ask you something?" I said. "Fair trade. When you say you're fine." I had been turning this over since our first conversation, the flat declarative that he deployed in place of what other patients deployed, which was fear or grief, or the performance of stoicism that barely concealed terror. "What does that mean for you?" A pause. "It means I always have been," he said, and I had thought about this answer since the moment he had given it to me in our first real conversation, the same answer he was giving me now. And each time I thought about it, I found more in it than I had found the time before. Not bravado, not denial. A statement of empirical record, a body that had been through every prior disaster and arrived, damaged and recalibrated, on the other side. Not certainty about the future, certainty about the pattern of the past. I have always been fine. Therefore, I have evidence for fine. I had 417 deaths by correct classification and 0 patients who had survived a terminal classification because I had not, in 62 cycles, Had a patient who treated the classification as a debate. That's a very human thing to say, I said. He almost smiled. The not quite one. Most probably. My luminescence was not at 40%. I noticed this sometime during the conversation and could not identify when it had changed. It was at 53%, still dim, still well below my normal operating brightness, but moving in a direction that surprised me when I registered it. Toward something. I stayed on the stool until the dim phase ended. I did not take any intervals. I was not certain I needed to. Mellon's second message arrived at the 17,000 pulse mark, and this one was not a request for clarification. Vessel Surgeon Thren asked, I have completed the resource allocation review for current patients. I want to be direct with you. The continued treatment of patient 7 Ferreira at active intervention level represents a resource commitment that the facility cannot sustain against the statistical backdrop of his classification. I understand you have formed a clinical assessment that the cascade scale may not apply accurately to this species. I note that this assessment is not supported by our database, by Veldrani medical consensus, or by the patient's current vitals profile, which continues to show multiple indicators in critical ranges. I am directing you to transition patient 7 Ferreira to comfort-based management effective next resource cycle. Please begin the transition of surgical suite allocation and blood factor reserves to patients within survivable classification range. I recognize this is a difficult situation. I am available to discuss it. Meln. I read the message standing in the corridor outside Ferreira's room. The fever had broken at the 16,200 pulse mark, precisely as he had said it would. The core temperature had dropped from its peak over approximately 6 hours. A gradual, controlled descent that looked nothing like the temperature crashes I was trained to manage, and exactly like what he had described. The body concluding a campaign. Winning. Filing the victory and returning to baseline. His blood pressure was now 78/52. It had been 60/40 on admission. The internal hemorrhage was holding at 0.81 volume. Still not resolved, but not progressing. The bleed arrested by mechanisms that did not exist in the literature I had trained with. The bone scans from this morning showed fracture callus development in all 4 sites that was, by the comparison module's assessment, 60 hours ahead of projected schedule. I stood in the corridor and I read Mellon's message, and I ran through the resource calculus that Mellon was asking me to run, which said, there are patients in this facility who have survivable classifications and limited access to blood factor reserves. And the blood factor reserves I was giving to Ferreira were blood factor reserves those patients were not getting. The calculus was not wrong. That was what made it difficult. I went into Ferreira's room. He read my face, or whatever equivalent of face reading he did. I was aware that my luminescence was probably communicating before I spoke. And he said, before I could. What happened? I told him about the directive. I told him about the resource review. I told him the arguments Mellon had made, which were correct arguments, and the conclusion they reached, which was that active treatment would end at the next resource cycle. He listened. He did not interrupt. He did not perform distress. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment, looking at the viewport. Okay, he said. Okay? I mean, I understand the logic. He said this without bitterness, without the performance of bravery that I had learned to recognize in patients who were afraid but would not show it. He simply, factually, understood the logic. Resources aren't unlimited. Someone else needs the blood factor more than I do right now. He paused. That's a reasonable call. I looked at him. I just need to know, he said. whether I can ambulatory myself out of here before the next resource cycle. Because if comfort management is starting in, he checked something on his wrist device. Approximately 4 hours. I'd rather be somewhere I can manage my own recovery than be in a bed being made comfortable. He was proposing to discharge himself, against medical recommendation. With a fractured femur that was 60 hours ahead of schedule, but was still very much a fractured femur. "You're not weight-bearing yet," I said. "I know." He said this like a logistics problem. "I can figure it out. I've done worse with less." He met my eyes. "I don't need the sweet time. I don't need the blood factor. I need a bone-knit wrap on the femur, the humerus, and the ribs, and something for the internal bleeding. If you give me the kit, I'll take care of the rest." I heard behind this the thing he was doing. He was trying to free the resources. He was trying to remove himself as a drain on the system so that the patients with survivable classifications would have what they needed. He was doing this for patients he had never met. I sat on the stool. I thought about the passage in the evolutionary biology section that I had reread 4 times, about the persistence predation, about the creature that did not sprint and collapse, the way everything that made evolutionary sense said you should sprint and collapse. The creature that walked and kept walking. Not because it was faster, but because it would not stop. I thought about Thelvas, the rational grief of the correct loss, the axiom I had built my practice around. I thought about 0.003%. That was not 0. "No," I said. He looked at me. "You're staying," I said. "And I'm going to speak to Mel." Thren asked, "You tried to give up the resources," I said. "Don't." I stood. That's a human thing to do, and I recognize it. And I'm telling you, it's not required. Something was moving in my chest cavity. The Veldrani analog of what the human reports described as a decision being made in the body before the mind catches up to it. "I'll speak to Meln." I left before he could argue. The conversation with Melon was the hardest professional conversation I had had in 62 cycles. Not because Melon was cruel, Melon was never cruel, but because Melon was right. And arguing against someone who is right requires something different than arguing against someone who is wrong. When it requires standing in the middle of their correct mathematics and saying, "The mathematics is missing a variable." I said, "His bones are healing 60 hours ahead of projected schedule." Melon said, "That is anomalous data from a species outside our database." I said, "Yes." I said, "His hemorrhage has arrested without direct intervention." Melon said, "That is also anomalous." I said, "Yes." I said, "His immune response resolved a fever that by our scale was terminal and left him measurably stronger than before the fever began." Melon was quiet. I said, "I am not asking you to update the Cascade Assessment Scale based on one patient. I am asking for a 48-hour extension on active treatment while I compile the species-specific data. If his condition has not improved materially at that point, I will transition to comfort management myself." Melon said, 48 hours. I said, "Yes." Melon said, 48 hours, vessel surgeon. I walked back to Ferreira's room and sat on the stool again. 48 hours, I said. He looked at me for a moment. "You argued for me." "I argued for the data," I said. He let this sit for a moment in the way he let things sit, briefly, practically, without ceremony. "Same thing," he said. I did not argue with this. His blood pressure was 78/52, and it was still going up, and the bones were 60 hours ahead of schedule, and the math was not finished yet. The alarm came at the 22,800 pulse mark, and it was not the patient alarms. "Hull breach," 3 decks down. Sections 14 through 18. Rapid decompression in progress. All non-emergency personnel to evacuation staging. The announcement cycled in the amber emergency cadence that I had heard 8 times in my career. And each time I'd heard it, my body's response had been the same. Luminescence drop, receptor pad contraction, the deep water instinct to pull inward, go still, wait for the pressure gradient to equalize. I was in the corridor outside Ferreira's room. I heard the alarm, and my luminescence dropped to 20%. The door to his room opened. Ferreira came out. He was not fully upright. The femur was still a femur. But he was moving. And he was moving with a speed and directness that should not have been possible in a patient 3 days post-explosive decompression trauma with a fractured weight-bearing bone. He had the bone knit wrapping on the femur that I had fitted 2 days ago. And he was using the corridor wall for support on the right side, where the humerus was still compromised. And his monitoring leads were still attached, trailing behind him like a secondary tail of where he had come from. He had the supply case from his room in his left hand. "Casualties?" he said. The announcement said, "How many? Which decks? What access?" His voice had changed. Not the dry, flat affect of a man lying in a trauma bay. Something cleaner than that. Something that had orientation and vector in it, the way a properly calibrated instrument has orientation and vector. I know this facility. I was reading the layout schematics last night. Sections 14 through 18 are adjacent to the secondary medical staging area. If the breach is rapid decompression, what we're going to have trauma casualties coming this way within the next 20 minutes. I looked at him. I looked at the monitoring leads trailing behind him. I looked at the supply case. "You're a patient," I said. "I'm ambulatory," he said, "and you're about to be understaffed." The secondary staging area alarm confirmed it. 3 critical, 7 serious, 11 minor, inbound from the breach area. The trauma bay was rated for 2 critical patients simultaneously. We had 1 surgical suite. We had me and 2 junior medics who were still in transit from their quarters. Ferreira walked to the supply case storage, opened it with his left hand, and began an inventory with the practiced speed of someone who had done this in conditions considerably worse than a well-lit corridor. He knew what he was looking for. He knew where it was, and he moved through the supply case the way he moved through everything. With the same practical efficiency, the same economy of motion, the same complete absence of performance. He was humming. I became aware of this slowly. The sound was low, almost below the level of the station hum, something I might not have registered if I had not been standing 2 meters away in a corridor that had gone quiet around the alarm cycle. A melody of some kind. Repetitive. Without words. He was humming while he inventoried the emergency supplies. My monitoring leads, his monitoring leads, the ones trailing from his chest sensors, were still reading vitals. I could see the readout on the portable display clipped to the supply case. His heart rate had elevated. His blood pressure had risen sharply. Which was? I noted this with the clinical precision I retreated to when the clinical precision was the only thing holding me steady. Not a danger sign. It was the opposite. His body was responding to the crisis the way it had been shaped. Over 100,000 years of evolutionary pressure on a Class 12 death world to respond. The first casualty came through in 17 minutes. Not 20. Ferreira was already there. I watched him work. I cannot accurately describe what I watched, because the language I have for medical practice is the language of Veldrani training, which has developed over 400 cycles of documented technique, and none of that language fits what I was watching. What I can say is that he moved through 3 critical patients in a sequence of decisions that I was, In each individual case, he able to follow this compound, this pressure, this intervention sequence, but whose totality operated at a speed and with a confidence that I could not account for using the training that produced me. He made calls that I would have categorized as high-risk interventions. They worked. He made calls that the junior medics, arriving in the bay, looked at with expressions I recognized as doubt, because they had the same training I had, and by that training what he was doing was outside protocol. He made those calls anyway. They worked. He talked to the patients, not instructions, between the instructions, brief, casual exchanges, the kind of words you offer to a frightened person to give them something to hold on to. In a crisis, I had learned not to do this because it consumed attention I needed elsewhere. He did it without consuming anything. It was somehow part of the same motion as everything else. My monitoring leads were still reading his vitals. His heart rate was elevated. His blood pressure was elevated. He was running on a fractured femur and a compromised humerus and an immune system that had just finished a 3-day fever campaign. And his biochemistry read. Not the engagement compound I had detected on the first night, not exactly. Something larger. Something that on my receptor scale was closer to the compound signature my species produces when, after a very long period of sustained effort, something finally resolves. He was in his element. I was standing at the monitoring station and the casualty list was updating, and I was watching a man who by every instrument I had should have been dead 3 days ago do the work of 3 surgeons. And I was holding the monitoring station display, and I was looking at the leads trailing from his chest, and I was watching the vitals that said, alive, alive, alive. And I was not thinking about the cascade assessment scale. I was not thinking about the death classification form. I was thinking about nothing that my training had given me the language for. The 9th fracture callus marker on his femur scan, the one that was denser than the others. I found myself counting the scratches on the floor where the supply case had been dragged. There were 4. The 4th was deeper than the rest. I cataloged this. I found it necessary to catalog it, because the larger things had stopped requiring my cataloging. He was humming again, between patients, while the next stabilization sequence ran. A low, nearly soundless melody that had no tactical value, no medical function, no reason to be present in a bay that had just received 3 critical trauma casualties and was waiting on 4 more. He was humming and working, and the monitoring leads were trailing, and the vitals said, alive. I filled in field 4 of the death classification form. I typed, not applicable. I filed it. The 4th critical casualty was Meln. I did not realize this until Ferreira was already working. Melon had been in Section 16 during the breach, the Resource Review Office, working late, which was typical of Melon in a way that I had always found both admirable and quietly sad. The blast decompression had thrown Melon against the bulkhead, and the injuries were familiar in a grim way, because I had trained on them. Familiar and serious. Ferreira looked at the injury assessment without slowing and made a call. The junior medics hesitated. The call was outside protocol, an intervention sequence that prioritized a secondary injury point over what standard Veldrani triage would have addressed first, on the grounds that, in this specific configuration, the secondary point was actually the primary threat. Do it, I said. They looked at me. I was looking at Ferreira. Do it, I said again. The call worked. I came close enough to assist at the 40,000 pulse mark, when the first wave of casualties was stabilized and we had breathing room between the last critical patient and the next incoming wave. And I was close enough that I could see the monitoring leads clearly. And Ferreira glanced over at me and said, very quietly, Melon's going to be okay. Not a medical opinion exactly, or not only a medical opinion. The flat declarative certainty of a man who had looked at the math and decided what the math meant. "How do you know?" I asked. "Because we got there in time," he said. "And because that one," a glance back toward Melon's Bay, "is too stubborn to go quietly." I had worked with Melon for 30 cycles. I was not certain Melon was stubborn. I was not certain Ferreira had any basis for this assessment. But Melon's vitals were stabilizing in the pattern that meant the intervention had worked, when Ferreira was already moving to the next patient. And I was aware that I had said do it without hesitation, which was not how I had made medical decisions for 62 cycles. It was how I was making decisions now. The breach was sealed at the 43,000 pulse mark by damage control teams who had worked through 3 hull sections to close it. The all clear came over the station announcement in the flat cadence that meant, "Danger has passed. Return to normal operations. Begin accounting." Ferreira sat down on the floor. Not dramatically. Not a collapse. A controlled, deliberate lowering of himself to the floor in the corner of the supply staging area, back against the wall, legs extended, the bone-knit wrapping on the femur still intact. He put his head back against the wall and looked at the ceiling, and the monitoring leads were still attached, still reading. His heart rate was dropping from the operational elevation, coming down in the measured, purposeful way of a system that had done what it came to do and was now returning to baseline. His blood pressure was 91/61. I stood in the doorway of the staging area and looked at this number for a long time. 91/61. He had arrived at 60/40. He had fractured 4 bones, arrested a hemorrhage, defeated a fever that by our scale was terminal, and spent the last 3 hours triaging trauma casualties on a broken leg. 91/61. I crossed the bay and sat on the floor next to him, which was not something I had planned to do. There was a supply crate that functioned as a seat, like the floor was cold and slightly gritty with the particulate that breach events always left in the ventilation. I sat on it anyway. "You need to let me reassess the femur," I said. "In a minute," he said. We sat in the grit and the post alarm quiet. "Melon's going to be okay," he said again. "Yes," I said. "I think so." "The call you made, telling them to do it. That was," he paused briefly, in the way he paused when he was choosing between several things he could say, and selecting the one that carried the most information in the fewest words. "That was a good call. I thought about Thelvas, about the rational grief of the correct loss, about the 417 and the form with field 4 left blank. I learned from available data," I said. He looked over at me. In the low light of the post-alarm staging area, with the monitoring leads draped across his lap and the bone-knit wrappings showing at the edge of his uniform sleeve, and the scar tissue on his left forearm that told a history I now had some of the context for. He looked exactly like what the classification form said he was. A human male in his late 3rd decade, battered, functional, requiring follow-up care. He looked like no one I had treated before. "Thank you," he said, "for the 48 hours. It was the correct clinical decision," I said. "Yeah." The ghost of the not-quite smile. It was. The monitoring leads read alive, alive, alive. I would need to reassess the femur. I would need to update the blood pressure record, recalculate the cascade score, document the events of the last 3 hours in a format that the Veldrani medical database would accept, which was going to require a notation field that did not yet exist for patient participated in mass casualty triage event, while classified as critical and significantly advanced their own recovery in the process. I would need to draft a new patient classification. The first in Veldrani medical history with a note attached that said something I had not yet entirely figured out how to say. First, I sat on the cold, gritty floor in the post-alarm quiet and let the system I had trained for 62 cycles recalibrate around a variable it had never accounted for. The monitoring leads draped across his lap read his pulse. Regular, strong, 91/61, going up. I completed the formal documentation at the 45,000 pulse mark, approximately 18 hours after the all-clear. Melon was in recovery, and the triage had been confirmed accurate by the senior medics who reviewed the case files. 12 patients processed in the 3-hour window, all stabilized, no deaths on shift. The Ferreira intervention calls were flagged for review, as non-protocol decisions always were. And I had written my clinical justification in the notes field with more care than I had written anything in recent memory. The care was this. I did not want the review board to dismiss the calls because the notation was imprecise. The calls had been correct. The data needed to reflect that they had been correct, and why, and what body of evidence supported the decision-maker's judgment. The body of evidence was this patient's entire presence in this facility. Ferreira's reassessment was the last document I filed. His blood pressure was 98/65, and the Cascade assessment score, I ran it 3 times, as had become my practice, returned 34%. This was still technically in the serious range. For a Veldrani patient with equivalent injury history, 34% would have been remarkable progress. For a human patient with equivalent injury history, who had spent 3 hours on his feet the night before, I was starting to think 34% was not the ceiling. The bones were not done healing. The hemorrhage was fully resolved. The bleeding had stopped. The body had reabsorbed the pooled fluid, and the imaging showed no active sites. The femur fracture was, per this morning's scan, approximately 70% of the way through the bridging phase that in my database typically took 6 to 8 weeks to achieve. He was on day 4. I had started a new file in my consultation system, where I had titled it Homo Sapiens Trauma Profile. Preliminary observations, and it was currently 4 pages long, and I had the sense that it was going to be considerably longer before I was done with it. I went to his room for the morning assessment. He was sitting up fully in the bed, both arms, no visible compensation for the humerus, which I noted. And he was eating again. The meal was something from the station's coalition food dispensary, not the Veldrani facility food, which he had eaten exactly once before, describing it as tasting like the inside of a coolant line, which I had checked and found to be, biochemically, a fair description. The coalition food was something with a red sauce that smelled of capsaicin. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning." I pulled up the assessment display. Blood pressure 98/65. Cascade score 34%. The hemorrhage is resolved. He looked at the display, processed the numbers in his quiet, practical way. "That's moving," he said. "The bone imaging this morning suggests the femur is ahead of schedule again." Good. He said it the way he said everything, flatly, as a data point, as a piece of information being filed. Then he paused. "Is Melon okay?" "Melon will require approximately 6 weeks of recovery. The injuries were serious, but the intervention was timely." I looked at him. "Your triage call." "It was obvious," he said. "It was not obvious to the junior medics." He considered this. It was to me. Not dismissive, not boastful. The flat factual register of a man describing his field of expertise. "I've seen that injury configuration before. Beyond the order you address it matters." "Where have you seen it before?" A pause. The not-quite smile, briefly. Classified operation. Different configuration, same principle. He looked at the red sauce food. You ever going to ask me about the arm? I looked at the scar tissue on his left forearm. I was waiting, I said, until you offered. He put the food down, looked at the arm for a moment. Not as though he were deciding whether to tell me, but as though he were choosing which version was most accurate. Bad breach event, he said. 7 cycles ago. We were sealing a compromised corridor. 3 of my people were on the wrong side of it when the structural failure accelerated. I got my arm through the gap before the frame closed. A pause. Kept it open long enough for 2 of them to get through. I looked at the scar tissue, the extent of it. The kind of damage that resulted from a structural frame closing on a limb, and what it implied about the force involved and on how long the limb had held against that force. 2 of them, I said. 2, he said. Not 3. He had gotten 2 through. I understood the arithmetic in his voice, the carrying of the 3rd one, the specific weight of an almost that does not close. I'm sorry, I said again. The same inadequate standard phrase, the only one I had. Yeah, he said. We sat in the quiet that kind of information makes. Thren ask, he said. Yes, when I'm discharged. He was choosing his words with the same care I was using on the documentation. The profile you're building, the Homo sapiens one. Yes. Make sure it goes somewhere useful. He looked at me directly. It's because the next Veldrani surgeon who gets a human on their table with a 0.003% score, they need to know that's not a death certificate. I thought about the 417, about the form with field 4 that said, not applicable, about the cascade assessment scale that had been calibrated for 63 species and was currently in my consultation system, being supplemented with preliminary data for 64. It will go somewhere useful, I said. He picked up the food again, eating with the same uncomplicated satisfaction as always. A man doing something ordinary after an extraordinary few days, and treating the transition between those states as another logistics problem that had been resolved. I completed the assessment and began to leave. Hey, he said. I stopped at the door. Section 4, he said, of the Atmospheric Recycler Manual, the part about the secondary circulation buffers. He was looking at the red sauce, not at me. It actually is interesting. I wasn't wrong about that. I'll read it, I said. I went back to my office. The Homo sapiens trauma profile was still open on my consultation system. I added the morning's data: blood pressure, cascade score, bone imaging, hemorrhage resolution. Then I added a section I had not had a formal category for yet, in the notes field at the bottom of the preliminary document. I titled it, Clinical Observations Not Covered by Existing Scale. The first entry was, patient participated in mass casualty event on day 3 post-admission, in critical classification, and demonstrably improved survivability outcomes for 12 other patients. Mouse, physiological response to sustained activity during this period showed elevated but stable vitals and post-event recovery consistent with purposeful exertion rather than physical compromise. Recommend updating cascade assessment parameters for this species to account for activity-assisted recovery as possible physiological mechanism. The second entry was shorter. It said, survivability assessment pending further observation of species. I sat back in my chair. The station was quiet in the way stations are quiet after something has passed through them. Not the ambient quiet of normal operations, but the specific quiet of systems returning to baseline, of personnel accounting for themselves, of the slow collective exhale after danger has been catalogued and filed. And I thought about what I would say if another Veldrani surgeon asked me about this case. If Mellon, in recovery, asked me to explain what had happened in the trauma bay over the last 4 days. If the review board asked me to justify the resource decisions, I would say the scale was missing a variable. I would say the patient's survival probability at admission was 0.003%, which is not zero. I would say a body that evolved on a Class 12 death world, that had been shaped by 100,000 years of being the thing that walks after everything else has stopped running, does not respond to crisis the way the scale predicts. The scale was built for species who sprint and collapse. This species walks, and walks, and walks. I would say these things with confidence, because I had the data. What I would not say, what I did not yet have the language for, in any tongue I had been trained to speak, was the other thing. The thing that was not in the data. The thing that was in the image of monitoring leads dragging across the floor of the staging bay, still reading vitals. In the sound of a man humming between patients. In the flat declarative certainty of I always have been. In the choice I had made 3 times to put the palliative line back and the death classification form face down on the counter and argue for 48 hours against a correct assessment. I did not have a word for that in Veldrani. I had checked. There was Thelvas, the rational grief of accepting a correct loss. There was Velthron, the steady presence of a colleague in crisis. There was Kethamar, and the specific satisfaction of a difficult surgery completed without error. None of them were the right word. Maybe the right word was in his language. Maybe it was the thing he said when I asked him why he told me he was fine. The thing he said with such complete flatness, such total absence of drama, that it landed harder than anything dramatic could have. I always have been. At the 47,000 pulse mark, I completed the documentation. At the 48,000 pulse mark, I filed the new patient classification with the notes attached. Survivability assessment pending further observation of species. At the 49,000 pulse mark, I went back to my office, opened the atmospheric recycler manual, and found section 4. My luminescence was at full brightness. I did not realize it until I passed the reflective panel in the corridor and saw myself and stopped. Full brightness. The brightness of good news or resolved surgery, or the particular kind of quiet that comes after a long-held thing has finally been set down. I had not been at full brightness since before he arrived. I stood in the corridor for a moment, looking at my own reflected light. Then I went and read section 4. It was, as he had said, actually interesting.